Hi, welcome to you all. My name's Nick John, and for the next 12 or 13 hours, I am the Vice President of the Association of Internet Researchers. Thank you. So they thought they should give me something to. I thought I should give me something to do, and this is it. I'm basically done now. Congratulations, those of you who've participated in the selfie game. Keep it up. There's stiff competition for top place, and there are actual prizes to be won, so you can still start if you haven't got in there yet, but go for it. And I am now going to hand over to Dr. Larissa Mann from Temple University, from the local organizing committee, to introduce the panel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm glad for this mic because I'm losing my voice. So we'll pretend a Muppet is here giving the introduction. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, which I'm going to follow up with information on how you can donate to support the Lenape Nation. And they also have a petition to the state of Pennsylvania to officially recognize them, which is at the same website. And I do encourage you to follow through on either or both and any other things on that site that they encourage you to do. So for centuries, the land now known as Philadelphia was home to and cared for by Native peoples. These include the Lenni Lenape people of Lenapehoking and the Patuxet of Delaware Bay, for whom this land has always been a space of teaching and learning. Land acknowledgements are important in recognizing the enduring legacy of settler colonialism, but they do not meaningfully adjudicate those inequalities, which require sustained commitment to Indigenous activism. So if you go to lenape-nation.org/donate, you can at least take a step in that direction. Again, there's more information on the site. I encourage you to do that. Okay, thank you all again. I'm going to introduce our plenary chairs, our distinguished plenary chairs. We have Zane Griffin Talley Cooper, who is a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, also a doctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Research on Global Communication, and a research affiliate for the Migration in Harmony Research Collaboration Network. His research broadly concerns the intersections and relations between data infrastructures, energy production, and resource extraction in the Arctic. A multimodal scholar with a passion for sustainability, he's held positions at Intel, the Civic Software Foundation, and the McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology, where he's explored the nexus of technology and environmental justice. His work has found its way into journals, art exhibits, design projects, film festivals, and he is the co-author of Digital Energetics, published by University of Minnesota Press. Lauren Bridges, our other panel convener, is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and from fall 2024, she will be assistant professor of media studies at University of Virginia. Woo-hoo. Bridges researches the social and environmental impacts of big data infrastructures with a focus on the cloud, in quotes, and the kinds of surveillance regimes, labor relations, and environmental impacts it makes possible and obscures. She's published in New Media and Society, Big Data and Society, Information Communication and Society, and is a co-PI for a multinational research grant from the Internet Society Foundation that traces the global flows of e-waste throughout the tech supply chain. Bridges received her PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you both very much and welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you all for coming out and for sticking with us. We're really excited for the conversation to come. So I'm Lauren Bridges, a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion along with my co-moderator, friend and colleague, Zane Cooper. Let me also introduce our panelists. So joining us via Zoom is Dr. Vusamuzi Maposa. We'll hear from him in just a moment. We can't see him right now. Dr. Maposa is the Information Communication and Technology Department Director at the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe. Dr. Maposa is also co-PI, along with Zane and I, and another one of our co-panelists, Ingrid Burrington, and also another one of our colleagues, Anne Chen, is here as well, along with David Zezai, Jasper Magwana, Dr. Margaret Maturera, and that's it. And we are a team, a multinational team of researchers where we've been looking at e-waste, or what we call digital wasting, throughout the tech supply chain for the last 2.5 years. And just as a side plug, we have an exhibit opening or reception happening tomorrow night at the Annenberg School for Communication between 5 and 7. So please do join us. Dr. Marposa has published book chapters and journal articles and presented on topics related to ICT 4D, ed tech, Industry 4.0, data mining, AI, and the semantic web, and e-governance. Also joining us on stage is another one of our grant collaborators, researcher, journalist, and artist and geographer, Ingrid Burrington. Miss Burrington has written for The Atlantic, The Nation, Popular, eFlux Journal, among other outlets, on topics related to network infrastructure, supply chain capitalism, infrastructural power, neodymium magnets, among many other topics. She is the author of the book Networks of New York, an illustrated field guide to urban internet infrastructure.
And we're also delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Nana Bonde-Thilstrup, Associate Professor in Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Dr. Thilstrup has written about the politics of data and digitization in a wide variety of contexts, including her books Uncertain Archives, Critical Keywords for the Age of Big Data, and The Politics of Mass Digitization, both out by the MIT Press, and public outlets, including the New York Times. Dr. Thilstrup is currently PI of 2 larger research projects, both concerned with the politics and epistemologies of data reuse and discarding practices. And finally, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Seyram Avle, who is Associate Professor of Global Digital Media in the Department of Communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Avle is a board member for the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations and a former visiting fellow at Harvard University Center for African Studies. Dr. Avle has written about the labor of tech entrepreneurship, innovation, hardware logics, techno-optimism, among other topics. She is currently researching processes of datafication in the Global South and the role that hardware plays in reuse and innovation communities.
Please join us in welcoming our panelists.
That's the panel.
So before we delve into tonight's panel topic, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our hosts, the Association for Internet Researchers, and all of the many, many folks that made this event possible. Thank you in particular to the 2 local hosts that really fostered this project through and made this panel possible, which are Jessa Lingle and Adrian Shaw. And also to the Air Board and to the organizing committee. Yes, shout out. To all of the many, many folks. Adrian, you deserve so many thanks. And to the hotel staff at the Sinesta Hotel, all of the Temple students and various different tech folks that have been helping us get this up and running. We really appreciate it. And last but not least, thank you to everyone for being here, for being interested in this topic. I know that I've already attended another panel this morning on internet infrastructures and their environmental impacts. I'm enthused by the conversation and some of the topics that have already been laid out. And we look forward to joining you in conversation. So let me now hand back to my co-moderator.
So the questions that this panel explores, they emerged out of this collaborative project that Lauren mentioned earlier on the global geographies of electronic waste throughout the tech supply chain. And this project is called Geographies of Digital Wasting, Electronic Waste from Mine to Discard and Back Again. And in this project, we've been wrestling with questions of how to bring together both thematically and materially and in solidarity these globally distributed communities that are impacted by all sorts of different forms and processes of waste and wasting across the digital world, from mining to manufacturing to data center operations, all the way to post-consumer e-waste discards. And in the midst of this research, broader conversations and concerns arose about how the field of internet research attends to issues of sustainability and what it means to do this research in the first place. So the title of this panel, Global Challenges to a, quote, Green Revolution for the Internet, we don't attempt to stake any sort of knowledge claim, but rather to pose questions about what we as internet researchers are advocating for when we interrogate the environmental impacts of the internet. And over the last 13, 15 years or so, so many wonderful scholars of critical infrastructure studies and critical data studies like Nicole Starosielski, Wendy Chun, Mel Hogan, Julia Velkova, Ann Pasek, and so many other brilliant folks have called attention to the vast and unrelenting materiality of the internet and its tentacular reach across geographies. Notably how subsea cable infrastructure is beset with geopolitical struggle and traces the paths of long-standing colonial and imperial communications networks, and also how data centers consume massive amounts of energy, water, and resources, and often exist in conflict with their communities.
Indeed, data centers have become a kind of popular scholarly proxy for illustrating the materiality of the internet. And as someone who studies the impacts of data centers and the so-called cloud, I'm aware of how limiting data centers are as a single object of study and how important it is to put them in context of the global flows and processes of the tech supply chain to really understand the broader environmental harms and injustices of internet infrastructure, many of which are hidden in disparate places and stages in the tech supply chain, in the sites of extraction of rare earth minerals for digital devices, in the coal mining communities, the fracking communities, and those affected by mountaintop removal for fossil fuel extraction, in the toxic exposures in the manufacturing processes of semiconductors, and in the long-term health impacts facing e-waste workers, which are disproportionately located in the global south. To think about a global green revolution for the internet, it is going to require a much more expansive way of viewing digital wastes and a deeper understanding of who and what is being wasted in maintaining digital connectivity, where and when the harms are happening, and who and what communities are being discarded in the process. So with this context in mind, let us invite our esteemed panelists into the conversation, each of whom are experts in the field of data toxicity and digital wasting, and will no doubt help us think through some of these sticky issues. I'm first going to begin with a pre-recorded video with remarks from Dr. Marposa, and then we'll move to the panelists and open up the discussion. He recorded this a few days ago.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. A big thank you to the Association of Internet Researchers for organizing this conference to promote critical and scholarly internet research, foster the growth of the internet, and enable scholars to tackle some of the emerging challenges. Thank you to the Internet Society Foundation for providing an opportunity to contribute to such a topical issue and present some views from the Global South. In many African countries, most of the unemployed people, including children, scavenge landfills for precious minerals and items deposited in electronic waste. This increases the risk of injury, infection, and exposure to dioxins and brominated flame retardants, polychlorinated biofilms, and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. The working conditions of e-waste workers are deplorable, with no protective clothing and ablution facilities, which exposes informal workers to direct contact with toxic elements. Women and children are the most affected. Children play on the ground and inhale toxic elements deposited in the soil. Dioxins such as lead, cadmium, chromium, polychlorinated biofilms, and others spread into arable land through groundwater leaching. Burning e-waste around landfills releases toxic elements into the atmosphere, polluting the air consumed by animals and humans. Fruits, vegetables, crops, milk and meat, and fish in the affected areas are poisoned. Around e-waste dump sites, high levels of dioxins are found in human placentas and human milk, resulting in high rates of stillbirths and deformed children. Other health effects include adverse alterations of the nervous system, infertility, and various cancers. The elements affect organs such as the liver, kidney, the cardiovascular system, and the pancreas. Children as young as 10 years work up to 12 hours a day at informal recycling plants where they are engaged in the dismantling and open burning of electronic waste. The United Nations Environmental Programme reports that exposure to lead and mercury contributes to about 600,000 new cases of children born with intellectual disability yearly. Informal e-waste workers have no knowledge of the complexity and the hazards contained in electronic waste. Therefore, they cannot comprehend the environmental and health hazards they expose themselves and others to. Informal workers suffer from skeletal injuries, respiratory diseases, cancers, and organ failure. The lack of regulations and policies to regulate this sector exposes the general public to environmental and health hazards. Lack of awareness of these hazards in e-waste and lack of technical expertise and financial resources make e-waste management challenging in most African countries. Most African governments have removed stringent laws on the importation of second-hand computers to bridge the digital divide and allow their citizens to connect to the World Wide Web. But their citizens cannot afford the new gadgets. Most of the imported computers are unrepairable and quickly become obsolete, contributing to the e-waste challenge. Some players in the global north find the global south a cheaper corridor to dump electronic waste than engaging in formal recycling. Research shows that exporting e-waste is 90% cheaper compared to formal recycling. About 75% of used electronics exported to Africa are unusable and destined for dump sites and landfills. Only 24% of African countries have e-waste policies, limiting their capacity to handle and account for electronic waste. Zimbabwe has no e-waste policy, and mineral-rich e-waste components are exported to the United Arab Emirates for processing by a company called Envirosev. Envirosev does not pay owners of electronic waste, and therefore there are no incentives. If e-waste is a $60 billion industry, there should be incentives provided to the owners of e-waste to promote sustainability of the sector. The extended producer responsibility model will not work in Africa, as major electronic producers are not present in the continent, and most electrical and electronic equipment are grey products, counterfeit and second-hand with no warranty. E-waste policies for developing countries should be modeled around the informal sector, which efficiently collects, separates, and dismantles e-waste. High-value e-waste components should be sold to recyclers for high-end processing, and also promote partnerships with recyclers in the global north to ensure that advanced processing is achieved in the short term. Most African economies are informal, resulting in increased activity at landfills and dump sites where individuals earn a living from recycling e-waste. Research reveals that individuals and organizations store non-functional electrical and electronic equipment at their premises as there are no collection systems and storage facilities, compounding the e-waste challenge. Local municipalities collect e-waste together with other household waste, and this is destined for municipal dump sites. The lack of a national recycling policy and infrastructure leaves waste management in the hands of the informal sector, which is highly unorganized and difficult to control and regulate. Recycling of e-waste is done through rudimentary tools and unfriendly environmental methods. Dismantling on unfortified ground, uncontrolled dumping, and leaching releases toxic elements that contaminate water and soil within the dump sites and surrounding areas. Burning plastic casings and coatings to recover copper, aluminum, and mineral produces ash and dioxins. We therefore appeal to the developed world to contribute in the combating of the effects of electronic waste on the poor and vulnerable by reducing e-waste exports to Africa. The Global North can also enforce the Basel Convention and the Bamako Declarations. We recognize that a total ban on e-waste exports is impossible, and there's a need to convert urban dump sites into urban mines. Producers of electrical and electronic equipment should sponsor and partner in setting up recycling infrastructure in developing countries and assist in enacting e-waste policies. I thank you.
Okay, thank you for that video, Dr. Mafosa. And I think he will join the conversation a little bit in a little bit. But for now, let's, on the other side of this informal economy that Dr. Mafosa talks about, we have the corporate sheen. So every tech company now has a chief sustainability officer, right? And innumerable startups are building solutions for things like carbon-aware computing, and companies like Apple are allegedly growing recycling programs to eliminate reliance on resource extraction for their products. I don't know how that's going. However, the on-the-ground effectiveness of all of these corporate initiatives are questionable at best, and just words about probably 50 to 60% of the time. So what is to be done, and where do we begin? So, Ms. Burrington, you have been researching the policies and uneven geographies of internet infrastructure for a long time, and you've been a great influence on my work. So from an infrastructural perspective, what and who do popular ideas of this corporate green internet most often exclude, and how can internet research better attend to these exclusions?
I feel if I'm speaking infrastructurally, I want to get under the stage or something. I will anyway. Thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you all for being here. So I guess I'm going to give you two things that maybe are frequently excluded. And the first one is neither are necessarily surprising in their absence. The first one is something that I've been thinking a lot about with regard to internet infrastructure as a term of art, is that it can sometimes create a misleading perception that the internet is a public good, as opposed to many private actors largely acting in concert. And that it has some sort of service component to it. And a game I like to play sometimes when I read corporate PR statements about infrastructure is to see how well the sentence still works if you replace it with the means of production. Because often when you talk about what does a data center do, it is the means of computation, it is the means of generating capital, right? What do fiber optic network cables do? They move information. They are the means of circulation. They are both. They quite literally circulate capital as well. So oh my God, the corporations don't think about capitalism. No one's quite taken aback by that. From the work that I've been doing as part of the grant that we are part of, one thing I've found really interesting is that the semiconductor industry, which is what Anne and I had been primarily researching for this, typically is at a pretty far remove from sustainability conversations. And by that I mean I feel like at least in the United States, conversations about the environmental impacts of chip fabs are just starting to kind of come back into media discussions because of the CHIPS Act and this sort of effort to increase domestic production. But it's still generally kind of backgrounded relative to the sort of full steam ahead. We have this geopolitical imperative to build out semiconductor infrastructure. And that seems kind of like a worrying absence insofar as, there's a kind of inescapably large quantity of chemicals, all of the chemicals that Dr. Maposa was discussing. It's those have to start somewhere, and they're generally going to be in huge concentrations in a lot of these facilities. In terms of attending to those exclusions, I mean, at least with the means of production, it's be communists or something. That's not really a great answer. But I think being very thoughtful about what we're talking about when we say the word infrastructure and what this project is. As far as the semiconductor stuff, I mean, I am wrestling with how to even conduct some of this research myself. So I'd say I got nothing.
That was awesome. Yeah, and thinking about the internet as a public good, and I don't know, the way in which that discourse is co-opted by corporations, I now want to shift from this question of the who and who is being left out of the conversation and how it's being framed by largely corporate discourses to the where. And Dr. Thilstrup and Dr. Avle, your respective work on data toxicity and tech innovation communities has been incredibly influential in the field of internet research. And I guess I want to move towards the where is this green revolution, if there is one, of the internet happening, and why in these places, what are the global dynamics at play, what sorts of inequalities do they create or reinforce, and what are the relationships between the geographies of tech innovation and tech toxicity. So,
hello. All right. Yeah. Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be at my first air. I float between media studies, STS, HCI. I'm everywhere but here. So I'm glad to be. Thank you. But yeah, no, it's a really big question, and I think in our earlier conversations, I said to you, I don't know what a green revolution for the internet means. So yeah. But I can talk about sort of the relationship between tech innovation and tech toxicity, in part because, and this is great that Dr. Maposa brought this up, I work with African tech entrepreneurs who live in communities that have been doing the circular economy before it became trendy here, right? Communities that have been reworking, reusing, recycling all of the things, right, including the waste that has been going into the global south before much of the world took notice. And as Dr. Maposa said, for e-waste, it's incredibly difficult to reuse some of those things, but there are other waste that makes their way onto the continent, right? And so I'm thinking of this collective, this enclave outside of Kumasi, Ghana, called Suame Magazine, where for 40 to 50 years, junk salvage cars from the global north have been sort of shipped to the continent, and where essentially what they're doing is remanufacturing, right? So your car that got a flood sort of rating and can no longer be put on the road here makes its way over there, and somehow they resuscitate this car and sort of put it back on the road in ways that sort of provide a lot of times public transportation to communities that don't have them, right? And so there is a lot of innovative use of things that are discarded and have been going on for generations. And I think it's important to remember that the labor involved, of course, has high costs, as Dr. Bafosa said. But there's also another narrative there of incredible sort of ingenuity, which in the work that I do on innovation often gets sidelined as sort of, because it's informal, it's not valuable, right? But it is that informal, devalued labor that essentially keeps much of this enterprise that we're all part of going, right? So I think it's important to keep that conversation, keep the Global South central in this discussion, but not just as the producer of raw materials and the receiver of waste, but as incredibly critical components in this supply chain that you mentioned, in its tentacular ways, right, all over, and the various ways that the Global South is quite central in providing solutions for the futures that we're all sort of afraid of and imagining at the same time.
Thank you so much. So to the question of when, because you prepared us already, so so I had to think about where, and then I went to see your exhibition, and you had Silicon Valley as one like central site, and then it got me thinking about my own visit last year. I was in San Francisco, and I spent time there with a visual artist called Manu Luksh. And so during our stay there, we discussed those, I don't know how many of you have been there, but they have these small signs on some of the lawns where it says, like, if you stay here too long, you expose yourself to harmful material, and so basically it's a liability issue. And we were like, what? And of course we knew Ingrid's work, but it was different seeing the signs and knowing that it was there, right? But that also led us to really think about what it means of, like, being in these places of multi-layered elements of toxicity, because primarily you mentioned my work on data toxicity. I've been thinking about the ways in which the logics of discarding that are also related to issues about devalued labor, for instance, and questions about perceiving something as matter out of place or designating something as waste, like a wasteland. So there are certain logics at play that have long histories and trajectories, and utilitarianism, colonialism, etc., right, that are entangled. But that also raises questions about how those histories that aren't necessarily tied to chemical waste and bodily harm also are then in that space entangled to bodily harm. And then just visiting your exhibition and my own experience of being at Silicon Valley, or being in those sites that we recognize as sites of harm, that led me to think about how we even map these places. And I think that for me leads to the question of like mapping, because we're talking about infrastructures as well, because I think my own experience, which is also what makes it difficult, is that these processes are happening at scales that are sort of hard both to transcend, or they seem to transcend an observational paradigm. So they seem to be so messy that it's impossible for us to put into a map, right? The reality is messy. And what happens then when we reify them as maps? And then I collaborate with an anthropologist called Matthew Archer, and he's been working on the ways in which even sustainability regimes produce like scopic regimes of surveillance, and what that produces for people who become subjected to those scopic regimes of surveillance. So I think those questions of where and our own sort of impulse to map and locate sites also bring with them questions that we have to then raise again to ourselves. And I think we can come back to that, maybe like issues around supply chains, which is a term and an imaginary that comes from the industry, of like the idea of traceability and that we can trace something back. But maybe we can also reach into different sites and produce different types of engagements. And I think there, both in your work, but also in your work, like those questions around community engagements and different ways of addressing and articulating experiences with these issues are important.
Yeah, and that was part of the impetus for this panel, was that like you said, the supply chain is this imaginary, but it comes from the industry, and as scholars who critique this stuff, we're often critiquing, using their language or using frames that, the same frames that these large multinational corporations use, like supply chain stuff. But like relations are often non-linear, and they like feedback into each other and fold onto each other in weird and dynamic ways. And that's part of like what we've been trying to do, and the project that we've been involved in is figure out how these different global spaces of like extraction or manufacturing or discard connect to each other, but not in a supply chainy kind of way, but in like supply chainy kind of way, but like in more non-linear, maybe like weird and dynamic ways. And so and that got us thinking about this idea of doing real global work. And so this is a question just for anybody to any panelist to chime in on, and then we can start a discussion going. But so I want to talk a little bit about the global, and like how do you understand the global in your research and balance the need for situating your work in particular local or regional context while connecting it to larger global issues of labor, datafication, and environmental harms. And so we can speak to methodological challenges of conducting global research on the internet, and especially the unevenly distributed environmental harms, and methodological and also theoretical challenges as well. So how does the global figure in your work in these types of inquiries?
I feel like you guys have a lot to say about that. Well, I want to check if Dr. Maposa.
Yeah. Can you hear us, Dr. Maposa?
Dr. Maposa, I wonder.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. We'd love to hear your input on the challenges of doing global collaborative work. And I think, most obviously, Dr. Maposa was going to be here with the whole research team from Zimbabwe, but faced visa issues along with other concerns, and will be joining us in a few days, which we're excited to welcome you. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk about some of the challenges of doing this kind of global and collaborative work. Over to you.
No, thanks. You can hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think the main challenge, especially from the global south, is understanding the topics relating to sustainability. I think so far we're lagging behind. We're lagging in terms of contextualizing what sustainability refers to. And therefore, even as we collaborate, you discover that there are so many gaps from our end. And such partnerships with the Global North will assist, I think, folks from the Global South to realize that sustainability is a key issue in all these things. Because otherwise, our populations, our people are affected by these elements, especially from electronic waste. So we need to be in the same understanding, especially and magnify the effects, especially of electronic waste on our populations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maposa.
Okay. Well, I mean, you asked a very direct question about how do we do this, and so I think, and I think in our conversations before, you might have mentioned this notion of following something and the sort of difficulty of doing that. But I found it quite helpful to follow a thing, and follow a person or follow an idea, right? So I follow sort of notions of innovation, whose practices are deemed innovative and whose practices are not, whose labor is visible and whose labor is not visible, what thing. When an artifact originates from Shenzhen, China, how does it make its way into the pocket of a market woman in Accra, Ghana, right? Those kinds of things are helpful for making sense of the global connectedness. But I find that a broader way of doing this work is to consistently have what I like to think of is a sort of historicist sensibility, and I've been talking about this recently from CSCW, I just came from there, is to remember that we're all connected. And I think it sounds sort of trite to say it now, but I think if your life is centered in a way, it is very easy to forget the rest of the world that historically has been structured to provide services for you and your life to be centered, right? So being in the global north, it is very easy to invisibilize the labor of the worst of the world. And that labor is what we're talking about, is getting rid of the waste or providing the raw materials, or doing X, Y, and Z. And so having a historicist sensibility in all of our work is a beautiful way of remembering these connectedness and being able to track and trace things as they move around the globe. One of the ways that I do this in my work specifically with tech entrepreneurs is by locating the work that they do within the global context that they position themselves in, right? So tech entrepreneurs in Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia are consistently put in a situation where they have to compare themselves to Silicon Valley or, you know, European tech entrepreneurs without access to the same kind of resources, right? So you might, and I've done this where I followed a tech entrepreneur into Silicon Valley, where the so-called center narrative is that if your project scales, then it has value, right? So the notion of scale is also visible in academic work, right? Generalizability, right? So we think of scalar categories as good in this particular sort of innovative space. And so you would think that projects that center the lives of the majority of the world would scale, right? But consistently, I have observed that that kind of skill is not valued, right? A different kind of skill, a skill that privileges certain kinds of lives and certain bodies are more important, right? And so doing the global and following how these ideas and these practices of, say, funding that really keep the internet we're talking about the way that it is, right? How they meet friction, how they break down, is a valuable tool, right? So keeping the I'm just summing up, keeping the historical sensibility, but also following particular notions as they move around and where they encounter these frictions can be quite instructive and quite helpful. And then in locating ways that we might intervene in this, because one of the challenges I think we were talking about is we end up sort of saying the same things over and over, and it's like, what do we do? Like, how do we intervene, right? So I think following practices and people in different parts of the world and collaborating with them can help us identify those places where there are cracks, where we might be able to intervene.
Maybe I'll just ask a question back, because I think also we were talking before about like the funding politics, and it seems to me that that's a huge issue as well if we talk about these things. So I really enjoyed the keynote yesterday, and I think that was also a really nice reminder to say, okay, there's also like the global is also in the very local context. You can go global in your own city and you find communities there. But for the kind of funding structure that you got, which was designated towards establishing those collaborations, I would love to hear more about your experiences with that.
I mean, yeah, it's been a great collaboration, and thanks goes to the Internet Society Foundation for we got a couple of our reps here who have allowed us to take a lot of liberties with this project, and who really had the foresight to bring us together with the Internet Society's Zimbabwe chapter in collaborating on this project, because we applied for this project just as myself, Lauren, and then another postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Advanced Research on Global Communication, and then in the midst of going through the application process, a program officer from the Internet Society Foundation came to us and said, well, there's this other grant proposal that they're doing very similar work, and we were wondering if you all can work together, and we don't know how this is going to look. It's the first time we've ever done something like this, but we want to see if maybe this will work. And so we jumped in head first, and we've made it work, and this project has grown into like a very productive and generative, like global collaboration of folks where, you know, we got to work with these great folks from the Internet Society Foundation. You know, we were able to bring on Ingrid and Anne to tackle an area of the tech supply chain that wasn't present in the first iteration of this project, the manufacturing side. And so the project has grown in ways that have been at times unpredictable, but it's all been very generative. I don't know if you have.
No, I have nothing more to add to that, except for that we've had incredibly generous funders, and it's been useful to have funders where I guess like they've given us the liberty to take this research in various different directions and given us the trust to do it. But also we haven't been beholden to any particular agenda, I would say. Their agenda has primarily been a collaborative, a fostering of a relationship between the global north and the global south. And maybe that's a rare kind of pocket of funding to find, but we're grateful very much for it. So I guess like this is making me think about also the historicist sensibility that you were just discussing, Dr. Avle. It's making me think about the frameworks that we apply to this kind of work and how we think about the complexities of bringing various different sites together, how we think about the methodological challenges of doing research across time zones. It's currently 1 or 2 a.m. in Zimbabwe. And, you know, technological issues. There were several times when we were meeting in Zoom calls and people's internet cut out or power cut out, and working synchronously and asynchronously across time zones and places. And I think a question that we've had both in this project and something that I'm still trying to think through in my own work is what are the theories and frameworks that we can apply and help us more comprehensively understand the ways in which the various parts of the tech supply chain, not in a linear way, but in a more tentacular way, to use Zane's word. Yeah. So what are some of the concepts, frameworks, and theories that we can work with?
Yeah, you guys are really into tentacles.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. That was a mistake.
I mean, look,
That was me. I'm sorry, guys.
I'm not here to judge. I guess I just to speak maybe to the challenges component of this. I can speak to from the work that Anne and I were doing. I mean, access, right? This is just governing. This is the problem of all kinds of, you know, at least depending on kind of the component of the supply octopus that you are particularly looking at. You know, the semiconductor industry is very secretive, is perfectly happy to not be a household name. I think that it's been very funny over the last decade watching data centers become sort of these like PR instruments, which actually make them much more available for academic research. And I think, you know, the extractive industries aspect of electronics has been a very, you know, rich and active area of inquiry for, you know, the last 25 years, longer even. But yeah, like certain parts, like depending on what part of the system you're trying to look at, you're going to run into you're just going to run into like certain pieces of it don't actually care if their story is told, or don't care if there is sort of deeper critical interrogation of it, and can afford to not care, right? So that's maybe just thinking about some of I guess in terms of methodologically, like sort of how do you address that? Some of that is like just trying every weird possible angle that you can to get in. So like when we were doing fieldwork in Taiwan, probably the best way that we were able to find people to interview was like talking to Anne's parents' friends. You know, it was like, oh, somebody knows somebody else, and like this guy's cousin does something like related to this other research thing. That's like, you know, it's like you can't go in the front door. Generally, I think that's just true. Like with a lot of these industries, if you kind of want to be getting beyond kind of traditional narratives, it's like you can't go in the front door. Like maybe you can try, but like,
I was at a panel a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this, where we were both activists and scholars, and I think that some of the questions that emerged there was the need to really get to know the communities that you work with, to empower them. And so we got in, and I think we talked about this before as well, the question about the data and the data production and what kind of data is needed. Because something that struck me was we were talking about, we realized at the panel that everyone who produced numbers got the numbers from Google. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but that was the only data source. And it was invoked that the data was better than what was produced, for instance, by Danish municipalities when it came to urban pollution. So that led us to discuss who gets to produce this data, and what are the conditions of accessibility that you say, like what's withheld, and who even gets to prohibit the production of data in the first place. But then also, because we can participate in this data production fetishization as well. I like numbers. But they can also produce a sense of uncertainty. So there are a lot of actors involved, and they all produce numbers. And when we talked with the activists, they were like, we don't necessarily need all the numbers. We just need something that's compelling that will get people to act. Which really led us then to also discuss, how do we also make sure that we empower the people that we want to be able to act on these numbers, right? How do we understand what their needs are? And then engage with the students as well. So that's what we talked about. So not only collaboration across geographical time zones, etc., but also across disciplines. So engage with engineers, engage with computer scientists, engage with geographers, engage with people who work in those fields as well, to develop better pedagogies as well for, basically understanding and developing these interdisciplinary conversations in the first place.
Sarah, do you have anything to add? Or? You don't have
sure.
to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you both kind of alluded to that, right? So grounding our work in place, right, is one of the ways that we can sort of do this work. But you asked about frameworks and sort of how we think about this, and I like to draw from feminist thinking, Black scholars, I think of Bell Hooks, who talks about the margin and the center, right? And that, for me, has always been helpful about figuring out how to think and talk about things like supply chains, like who is in the center and who's in the margin, and what marginality means and who produces that kind of thing. Feminist geographers and technoscience, people like Sarah Ahmed and Karen Barad and the like, all talk about, sort of place mattering, right, and situated knowledge. And so I draw from those places to think about, where to look, right, and then where to collaborate, which both of you are talking about, right? So finding the right communities, whether it's, it's through familial ties, or through research communities that are maybe overlooked, right? But people who practice the work too, right? So drawing from that sort of notion of always looking for community, looking for ways of care, grounding in place, then has methodological implications of finding collaborators in particular spaces that, you might have overlooked if you didn't sort of enter it with that kind of framework, right? So that's, my thinking on that.
Okay, okay, so I think we're going to have one more big question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So one, we were talking about interdisciplinarity and opening up conversations to other fields, and one field that has been particularly influential for me in my work and has influenced our the direction that we've taken on this collaborative project is discard studies. And so one key framework from discard studies, in which we and our panelists have been wrestling with, is this theoretical distinction between object and process in studying the internet and its environmental impact. So in their book, Pollution is Colonialism, which is, if you haven't read it, it's just like just the best book of the last 10 years. Max Liboiron argues, quote, science always happens with land relations, and those relations are always specific to that place, even if you don't believe in land with a capital L, end quote. And so Max Liboiron treats land with a capital L as a verb rather than a noun, to emphasize kind of this ongoing enactment of relations that define land more as a process and structure rather than just this static thing or outcome or place. And so we can see data in the internet like this too, not only as outcomes or descriptors of outcomes, but as these active relations that enroll communities, capital, and ecologies in these ongoing processes of wasting instead of waste. So what might we gain by seeing the internet, for example, not as a thing or like a collection of things, but more as a process or, structure defined and determined by these transnational flows of resources, materialities, labor, and practices of wasting, like this active. How might that change our approach to research on internet sustainability, this processual kind of thinking?
Okay. Well, I think it comes back to what I said before about, because I also like following things, and but I also realize that, like, for instance, I've tried to follow data, and it's really difficult. And I think understanding what's useful about thinking through the tracing, but also why we can't rely only on idea of the fixity of the map, for instance, right? And I think that that's where the discard studies people are really helpful in trying to understand where do these processes of evaluation take place, like when does thing change from one thing to the other. I was really interested in hearing before about, how does this process evaluation of this waste also gets changed from one geographic and political national context to the other, right? And then I think based on that, the discard studies, what I really appreciate about is that it has this attention to power differentials. So centering anti-colonial knowledges, like before we talked about, and like the perspectives on questions around extraction, labor, recycling, and wasting, right? So I think for me, those questions around the processual open up those so that we don't remain only within the map, which is crucial. But I think that you talked about before, like how do we get also beyond the mapping and the exposing towards being able to also, act.
So two things that come to mind. So another like crowd I sometimes hang out with are the computer historians, and I think that a shift towards process rather than objects is something that is very interesting to see kind of emerging in that field. So probably friend of people on this panel and people in the audience, Matt Hockenberry has this great line, about how there's a lot of histories of the computer. Right, and that kind of means like history of some guys who had, or that's often how it's told. But it's the story of an invention, an innovation, and a patent, and a business model maybe. The history of computers, of which there's slightly less, is a history of manufacturing design and like production management and labor and extraction. I wrapped up a project earlier this year trying to just trace some of the kind of mineral sourcing of some of the very first silicon chips, and like I was kind of like, oh, surely someone has looked in. Nope. Yeah, no, did that. That was hard. Anyway, and I guess as a related kind of thought to this, just this kind of historical or kind of framing is one thing. At least I would be cautious about with thinking about process over objects, as insofar as process is not synonymous with progress. I think sometimes there is a misunderstanding that understanding something is kind of an ongoing thing that sort of is in flux, is that it might potentially have a linear narrative towards better outcomes. And I mean, we're all using the internet in 2023 and it's worse, right? So I think, it's like I feel like that's an uncontroversial statement. I don't know. But I think the impulse towards a process-based thing, I mean, the number of times we talked about like linear being kind of opposed to linear time as a premise, I think it's pretty clear what team we're all on. So I don't really worry about that with any of y'all, but I think that's something just that I try to be mindful of, especially like because history loves to kind of have a linear narrative because actually, you know, that they're really into time only going one direction.
Yeah, just I like the notion of wasting the procedural process part, but I'm also a little cautious in terms of because there's a sort of applying that to like data, right? And for me, the waste there suggests that sort of it's like, oh, something has to be useful. You know, there's if it's not useful, if you don't use it, you're wasting it, right? And it's a finite resource, which the planet, the things that we were using, they're finite, and so you don't want to waste those things, right? Or things that are finite, you don't want to waste. But the other side is that, you know, in relation to data is that you collect all of it all of the time because in the future you might have a use for it, and you don't want to waste it, so you collect and you hoard it, and that struck me as like I'm not sure I want that notion of wasting in that sense. So like when we're using it with data, I want some sort of parsimony with the term, because I'm thinking of like the feminist data manifesto that Marika Sifo, Patricia Garcia, and others have written about, and sort of this particular framing of how we should think about data right now. And I think that notion of wasting might be in slight opposition to that. So I don't know, I'm not sure, but I would like some thinking around that. You know, whether when we're sort of thinking about wasting as sort of like a progressive term in sort of theorizing the space, but it has this other side that I think might be slightly problematic about it. Something has to be useful for you to waste it. So I want people to play with that.
Yeah.
This is as much as I can give at like 7:30 after a very long day. So sorry.
I think that's. Oh, sorry.
No, it was just that's exactly what drew me to those questions around like the data exhaust and those metaphors that are being used as designating something that is being wasted if it's not used, right? And so it has to be used, and then for some people to say, well, we don't have to pay you for it because it's something that you left anyway. So, but we can monetize it, and then we can draw value from it, right? So it's those questions around also how those value processes become embedded within our understanding of what is waste and to whom, and when we waste something. Yeah.
It also makes me think about in data centers how redundancy is a inherent value. You know, it means that data is more secure, so waste in that sense has value, and wasting as a process, well, to data center operators, has some kind of value. I love that we don't have any consensus up here, and that we keep kind of pulling out different concepts and working with them and wrestling with them and realizing, you know, that there are limitations to these concepts. So at this point, I'd really love to hear from the audience and invite you to ask questions, join us in this conversation. Yeah, I imagine that we don't have consensus in this room, which is always exciting. So yeah, we'll give you a moment to...
We also understand that there's been some drinking, so it's okay.
Day 3.
We could call it early.
Do you want this one? Yeah.
Sam, go first. Oh. Okay. Hi. I've been drinking too. I'm sorry.
That's great. Welcome.
Yeah. So you're sort of the last comment about data redundancy, and you know when you talk about the processes of making that redundant data is inherently generating waste. I couldn't help but think about like something I read somewhere a long time ago that someone said, isn't it ironic that we have Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets from 5,000 years ago still, but I can't get the data off my zip drive from 1990 something, right? And there's this sort of idea of this ephemerality because of this disposability in the technology. I was wondering if you could comment on some of that, because I love this panel so far.
I'll take a mic. Well, I can't speak to the redundancy, but I can maybe. I also need a drink now. But what I can say is that I was writing, and I also want to shout out to my editor at New York Times, because I was the author, but really, if you write an essay for them, they also write it. And so, but they asked, like, because throughout this remark, the essay was on data loss. So exactly what you described, right? And then I say, because of the increasing obsolescence of technologies, we have more and more data loss. Basically, we increase our cycles of. And they were like, can you produce numbers or any evidence of increasing cycles of obsolescence? And I have to say, it was really difficult to produce those evidence, right? So there are like a few scattered marginal pieces that weren't cited a lot, and it's not my field, right? So I just felt like this is something we know. It's a vibe we have. Things are like turned around faster, but we have very little evidence of it, which just made me think about, like, obviously we know that the cuneiform tablets are still there, and we know that we can access this, but just the lack, and I think that comes back to what I said before about, like, the research politics, like what gets funded, what gets published, what can we, when do we have, like, industry supporting research? When do we have actual research politics and that allows us to trace and publish on those things? So I don't know why nothing has been published on it, but it's really difficult to find substantial research on it. That's all I can say.
Yeah, so thank you so much for such a beautiful panel. Plenary as a panel is amazing.
It's Fernanda Rosa, if you don't know. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am excited to see you here. And I'd like to ask you about, well, you are showing us some of the invisible aspects of what the industry is calling always supply chain and all that. I would like to ask you about how you see, from your perspective, from your research, the role of code in e-waste. Like, we see the turn to infrastructure in our studies of the internet, and it is amazing. We should all be excited about that, as we were very focused on the cultural studies, and now we have this other side, very broad and big, as this panel is showing. But we are still focusing on what we see. Data centers and cables, and what is amazing, yeah, they are there. But I would like to ask you about, what about code? What is the code that you see also governing these processes? And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, I guess one thing maybe to speak to with this, I feel like there's the work I've seen, at least kind of in that space, partly has to do with like writing software more. Often it's kind of framed as sort of like writing software more efficiently, which I have sort of mixed feelings about, because like, oh, it's like, I guess cool, like but you're probably just going to write more software if it's more efficient. This is maybe not going to work out so good. But there's also, a really rich and interesting world of projects thinking about sort of computing. I mean, there's literally the conference Computing Within Limits, that thinks about strategies for like what sort of best practices in computation, and thinking about resource consumption, or just other models of kind of constructing networks. So like the project Solar Protocol by Tiga Brain, Alex Nathanson, and I don't remember Benedetta's last name. I'm sorry, but that project is a small kind of net. It's basically a website that exists on several connected solar-powered computers around the world. The availability of the website and which server you're hitting is going to depend on how much energy any given server has and what the sun is doing. Which means that you have a website that like maybe isn't always available. Or its availability is kind of determined by the shape of the network. And I don't know, there's also a kind of preppery project, but I think is really fascinating called Collapse OS, which is based on trying to design an operating system for the lowest level computing component possible. In this case, it's a kind of microcontroller that you can find in a lot of really basic consumer goods like microwaves and stuff. And it's just sort of a like, I find it like it's a very compelling example of like trying to think about if like building computers from a very, very foundational level and then kind of working up as opposed to like, yeah, just thinking about like what's like, what salvaging and kind of like building new computational systems really requires.
Can I jump in? Yeah. It's a really great question, right? Because it's code is invisible. I mean, we see the outcome and we don't often think about it in many ways. And I just mentioned that I was at CSU Dublin on a panel with Meg Marathi, who's at MSU, who was talking about sort of in the context of working around things like gender categories, right? So, and stay with me, I will learn this example. So they were saying something to the effect that, yes, we have these meetings and we say, okay, we need to change certain structures and be more inclusive. But nobody talks about the work that needs to be done on the back end to get these things to work, right? So you might say TSA needs to change certain categories to allow certain things to happen. The government needs to change the code on one end, your university. So like they were talking about all of that back end code work, engineering, computer engineering work that is often controlled by institutions or corporations, right? So but invisibilized in a particular kind of way, right? And requires extra effort to sort of effect the kinds of changes. Something simple as changing forms on government websites. You might think that it's a simple thing of someone just making one change, but because systems don't talk to each other, standards are different and standards change, code language itself changes, right, over time. And now we have these AI efficient sort of, writing code. Like there's so much different layers of this that I'm really glad that you surfaced this. And I think it's important that as we sort of research and think about other aspects of the internet, like that code, and your code ethnography is really great at this, right? To get us to think more about that end of the internet that I think stays largely invisible to especially social science researchers, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I love this question. And last year I worked at Intel and on the green software team. And so like green software is this is that there's a big industry push for this idea of green software across all sorts of different organizations. Like there's, Intel, Google, Accenture, Microsoft, like there's this push to green software, but there's not really like a consensus on what exactly it means. And so we ran a big survey that was put out for the Green Software Foundation, and honestly, what I found so interesting is that the connection between code and management of building that code in an organization. So there are so many engineers and software developers who on teams who are very passionate about sustainability and want to do something to help, they want to make their job greener somehow, or do better, more efficient code, but they feel hamstrung by management, most of them. And so I don't know, there's this idea about green software, and in industry right now most of it is just about shifting workloads to regions where electricity might be greener at the particular moment. So if there's renewable power in like Sacramento at at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, then that's where the workload will take place. But this is mostly where green software is right now. There isn't a big push to like make it necessarily more like efficient or like low code, like Solar Protocol. Like there aren't these questions in industry about like, do we really need all this code, all of these things? Like what like how do we need to be always building and building and building and building? Like maybe that's not the most sustainable practice. I don't know. Just coming from a green software team where like there was just no real consensus of what we were actually doing. like I feel like green code. Yeah, and I think that it's gotten a little bit more well defined, but like there's it's just still very in the weeds. So
I think we have time for one more question. I don't want to hold everyone up all night, so go ahead.
It's a lot of pressure on me. My name's Robert Gale. I've had 2 glasses of wine on an empty stomach.
I love these disclosures.
I'm going to ask a selfish question because I'm working on a book about the Fediverse, and I'm interested in making a more ecologically federated or friendly social media. And so I'm looking at 2 camps of thinkers. One is the degrowth camp, and there's a lot to like about degrowth, the reduction of the obsession with growth related to what you're talking about. But at the same time, degrowth activists tell me, like, as soon as I say degrowth, people are like, no, I don't want to hear anything about degrowth because growth is an unadulterated good right now. So another camp I've looked at are the solar punks, and they're sunny and optimistic, but they're easily appropriated by capital. So I guess basically what I'm asking is, do we need to despair or do we need optimism?
You want to go?
I mean, that's a conversation for you and your therapist, I think, and my therapist. I think so. It sort of seems like part of the question is like, what is the messaging methodology for getting people on board for like maybe the computer's too much and could have not this way. Yes? Okay. So it maybe the maybe one way of thinking about this, one way I try to think about this is trying to engage with people on the level of like, what do you actually want? And then how to approach getting it, because like most I cannot describe what most people want because that's the same. But I find like in my anecdotal experience of like sort of despair versus like give a unfettered optimism is like, yeah, most people kind of are somewhere between that. And like in terms of like what do most people I engage with, like there's the idea of sort of infinite anything is like understood to be like it's not really a thing. And yeah, I think approaching it from more of a grounded like what actually do you want to build as opposed to like, and then you can kind of get into like how do we want to do that, because yeah, that's one option. But yeah, also maybe like that's also like an existential question that this panel cannot fully address. I apologize.
Yeah, just one word. I keep thinking of refusal, and I don't know where that fits in the degrowth movement, folks. But sometimes sort of encouraging refusal and no's as a legitimate response. So, can we make this thing faster? Yes. Do we need to? No. Should we do it? No. We don't have to build everything, right? And that's sort of that discussion of like progress more and more. But sometimes no, and let's just not do more of it is a perfectly legitimate sort of response. And also we don't have to research this thing. Sometimes that's also a legitimate thing because it's not perhaps like our story to tell or whatever. But I would like us to enjoy refusals as a sort of legitimate way of approaching all of the things that we're talking about, and maybe that might encouraging the tech workers to also refuse a lot more the mandates that are coming down, like tech labor coalitions and sort of banding together and refusing the capitalist laws has worked in limited, but you can't, bully the CEO to not build the thing that will harm people. It's possible. So.
Do you want to?
Well, it's just because I'll be working now on questions related to data delimitation and data loss, and I think also working with people who are used to thinking in terms of scarcity, because they're very good at making decisions. So if I talk to computer scientists and people working with machine learning, which is one strand of my research, basically none in those departments work on data deletion, right? So they work within a paradigm of accumulation. But then if I work with archivists, they know very well that there are limits, and they also know the existential angst of wanting everything but having to make choices. So they have knowledge that is really useful for people who now, whether they want to or whether demands are placed upon them to reduce their energy usage or whatever, there's knowledge out there to help them sort through those things. Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of the panel. Thank you all for sticking with us, and please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. And to the Zimbabwe team who are still awake, thank you.
Good job, well done.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Dr.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic.
We'll see you on Sunday or Monday.
All right. Thank you, guys.